Racing games have crashed and burned, and it's our fault. I've seen racing games go from this to this. Today, racing games top the gaming industry's spending. They boast laser-scanned tracks and realistic physics, but they often lack character. Many feature microtransactions, emit old elements, and have tons of bugs. These games mirror the industry's problems. They fail to capture the love for cars and car culture, which once made them enjoyable. Still, we buy them. Why? Because no other option exists. This is how racing games crashed and burned. The immersive qualities of modern graphics are commonly used as a marketing gimmick today, but mid-sized developers were actually developing games about the 24 Hours of Le Mans as far back as 1999 for the Sega Dreamcast of all things. Games like this are commonly looped into the so-called golden age of racing games from the 90s to the early 2000s. The 80s marked a period of increased media coverage for motorsports, helping the sport of racing become a more commercialized phenomenon. So why do companies have such a hard time capturing what made these games so fun nowadays? If this game is considered great, and this game is just this game with better graphics, then it's gotta be good.
What about the microtransaction? Will there be? Thank God. Okay.
It was a clear-cut response with no misunderstandings. Yamauchi fully denied the notion that Gran Turismo Sport...
Look, we can beat the whole microtransaction thing like a dead horse, but there's obviously a lot more to it than that. The modern sim game, iRacing, is considered one of the best on the market with a laundry list of purchasable downloadable content, whereas the modding community for Richard Burns Rally, a game that is 2 decades old, has more content than you can possibly beat in your lifetime for absolutely free. The point is, in the late 90s and early 2000s, it wasn't hard to find a fun racing game. You didn't have to do any research. You had Burnout, Ridge Racer, Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, Project Gotham, Midnight Club, Mario Kart, F-Zero, Test Drive, 4, 5, 6. This was a great era for racing games, mainly because a lot of the concepts at the time were novel. Mario Kart was a party game that anybody, regardless of skill, experience, or intoxication level, could play. If you had a Nintendo console in your house, you had Mario Kart. That was just a no-brainer. Games like Burnout were considered arcade racers, mainly because, just look at it. Tons of other video games were about giant robots and alien invasions, but many racing games were about real cars. The game that really kicked the entire industry into high gear was an old game called Gran Turismo, released on the first PlayStation. Gran Turismo had a focus on accessible realism, letting the average person experience the essence of cars at a pace they felt comfortable with. Yet, if that was a little too boring, casual gamers loved Burnout and Need for Speed for their high-speed crashes and wild antics. This era of racing games gave everybody a way to participate in car culture that didn't really exist before. Old-school racing games were more than just a way to pass the time. They were a way to celebrate these machines that represent our lives in so many ways. Cars look, feel, and behave in unique ways, in real life and in video games. Cars have personality. Mario Kart was a game about racing. Racing games were games about cars. The legacy of many of these games can be hard to track down. For instance, Captain Falcon is probably known more for his appearance in Smash Bros. Than a game about hover cars that was made in the 90s. Ridge Racer is long gone.
It's Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer. Remember that one?
And nobody even knows what Forza Horizon has in common with Grand Theft Auto. The point is, before the industry got consolidated and heavily corporatized, the mid-sized developer was a unique way to hit these markets. A large AAA studio with thousands of employees might not have wanted to go all out on a game about running into as many cars as possible. Likewise, a small indie studio of about 10 people might not have had the resources necessary to get the crash physics right. But a mid-sized developer could. These studios had a perfect balance of ambition and practicality, producing polished, high-quality games that publishers didn't feel terrified to back up. Cars are cool. Computer graphics seemed like an easy space for them to occupy. You can't drive a Lamborghini, but you can drive one in Forza Motorsport. Sure, you don't really know the difference between what a Lamborghini and a hatchback can do, but you can see it in the context of a video game. But the usage of real cars can pose a problem. Even when the real car is in a game that's not real, You still kind of trick people into thinking it's kind of real. And to make things even more complicated, there's tons of different types of real racing. There's open wheel, stock car, touring car, endurance racing, rally racing. Racing on snow is different than racing on mud, or racing on an oval, racing on a windy track, or racing for 24 laps as opposed to racing for 24 hours. As long as there are many different types of cars, there are going to be many different types of racing. So you usually gotta pick one specific kind and do it well. Spread your net too wide and you don't get any customers. Suddenly, you start to understand why the guys who made Mario Kart made Mario Kart. Regardless, the first video games I and many gamers ever played were racing games. Something a lot of these games had in common was a clear and obvious passion for car culture. To me, Mario Kart was a little kid's game. What I was playing was different. When I was very young, my parents got me an Xbox for Christmas, and I sank hundreds of hours into Sega GT 2002. Instead of speeding through a blocky-looking city in Test Drive 4, I was on real tracks meant for real race cars, and I was hooked. It had an exhaustive list of cars I'd never even heard of. Hey Dad, what's in a barf? A what? Our neighbors had kids who played games that kind of looked like mine, but they weren't quite the same. This is the game my buddy Jimmy played, NASCAR Thunder. His old man would have the real thing playing 24/7 on the living room TV. Jimmy didn't just like racing games, he wanted to be a race car driver himself. The baseball kids looked up to Derek Jeter and played games like MLB 2K. My buddy Jimmy looked up to Dale Earnhardt Jr. It's interesting to see the parallels in the box art with this NASCAR game and a typical sports game. Games like NASCAR Thunder weren't really racing games. Okay, yeah, they had racing in them, duh. But they were more like motorsports games. And that's not the same thing. Not the same thing as Need for Speed, anyway. Still, Need for Speed leaned into a particular niche of its own. The adaptability of the license was what made it work. It sits under Mario Kart as the most widely selling racing license of all time. Need for Speed didn't need to be a sim. You just needed a fun game about running from the cops and tricking your ride out. But some people really want to do this stuff. So when they play a video game about it, they're gonna have a certain expectation about what driving the car feels like.
Some newcomers to BeamNG Drive are caught off guard by how difficult it can be to control cars. Often people expect the cars to grip the road well past realistic limits, and are surprised when traction is lost at relatively low speeds.
This is an extreme example, but the mid-2000s were the point at which the market hadn't broken up into too many pieces quite yet. If it felt a little too arcadey, it wasn't a big deal, because just making a game about racing cars was a cool idea in and of itself. But the turn of the millennium brought out better technology that gave developers tough questions. Do you make your game more like a simulator, or do you make your game more like a game? Well, Mario Kart figured that out and made $1 million crap zillion dollars. But throughout the 2000s, tons of different studios would all try to answer this question. And sadly, not all those names would last. As the decade pressed on, expectations from publishers got strict. If you cut the corner just the wrong way, it was enough to make you crash. Marketing a racing game is just as difficult as any other gaming market. Cars are ubiquitous in reality, so you have to account for an expectation of realism. What are the game's physics like? How much or how little can you adjust your car? Does the car tend to slide or grip more? Does the game have power-ups? Does the game not have power-ups? Everyone is going to have a different opinion about it. Nothing represents the controversial difference between sim and simcade racing game designs better than rally racing games. Accurately depicting this motorsport in a video game engine is very difficult to do. You have to depict handling on different surface types and mechanical damage from big hits. One advantage rally games had over traditional circuit-type racers is that they could be raced on your own in a single-player environment. Its time-based approach incentivizes individual improvement and punishes mistakes.
Don't cut. Crest. 130 crest jump.
Dirt is exclusively a game about rally racing. But even still, it's a good barometer for assessing the mainstream appeal of realistic racing games in general. It started as Colin McRae Dirt. But some people don't call Colin McRae Dirt a racing sim. Or Dirt 3. Or especially Dirt 5. Why is that? It looks more realistic than this.
Colin McRae, born to race.
The technology for these kinds of games was still developing, so it helped to add a little bit of credibility to your marketing approach. That's why they put Colin McRae's name on the game. Because Colin McRae was a real racist. Colin McRae was a real race car driver. In 2004, Colin McRae Rally was on its 5th installment, and each of these games have been received tremendously well. It lost GameSpot's Best Driving Game of the Year award to Burnout 3 Takedown. That was okay. Burnout was obviously a game. This was the real deal. This was realistic, like a real race car. It wasn't going to be for everybody, right? In 2004, another famous rally racer tried to compete in this market with Richard Burns Rally. Compared to Colin McRae Rally, where the cars seemed to kind of glide and slip around on top, the cars in Richard Burns Rally felt like they were one with the road. New physics tech allowed Warthog Studios to create a truly immersive and exciting racing experience. It flopped. Games Radar described it as positive proof that famous rally drivers really are cold, inhuman computer people. 3.5 out of 5 stars. Not because it was bad, but because it was hard. Immediately following the release, the studio that developed it got bought out. The point of this story is that casual versus competitive gaming is not a recent argument. It hit the racing genre first, and there were consequences for making the wrong move. These kinds of games were not easy to make. You had to learn the difference between marketing a sports game and marketing a game that happened to have cars in it. An IndyCar racing game was about the sport IndyCar. Midnight Club was a game about exploring the city of Los Angeles. If you make Midnight Club, you'll get a Wikipedia article that's this long and set the groundwork for GTA, one of the best-selling video game franchises of all time. Make a great IndyCar game, and you'll get a Wikipedia article that looks like this. Midnight Club was a pivotal stepping stone for the open-world racing games we love today. Grand Theft Auto is considered equal parts an action-adventure game as much as it is a racing game. Cars were a central focus of Midnight Club's design, but it was a game first, and it had more pieces to it than cars are cool. The game had intense police pursuits wherein players had to skillfully dodge roadblocks and race against the law. The game's recreation of Los Angeles had lively environments with traffic, pedestrians, and obstacles. It captured the essence of street racing culture, with clubs, underground races, and great atmosphere. And if you did want a challenge, there were skill-based challenges like precision driving tests and time trials. That competitive edge was still there if you wanted it. You could show your personality through your car. Whereas, in a strictly motorsports-focused game, you show your personality through your driving skill. Again, if you wanted your racing game to work, it needed to be accessible. This was a market about wide appeal, not overly involved, super specific niches and super complicated racing sims. That market was considered an enthusiast market. It obviously helped that Midnight Club was developed by Rockstar, whose reputation preceded it even back then. But it wouldn't help a mid-sized developer trying to make it in this industry. Microsoft and Sony would make sure of that. A year after Midnight Club, in 2009, Forza Motorsport got its 3rd installment. If it weren't for Forza Motorsport 4, there wouldn't be a debate about it being the best Forza game of all time. Microsoft's competitor to Sony's Gran Turismo looks great in Xbox 360 colors. Both of these franchises had a predominant focus on circuit racing, established tracks that go around in a loop, usually attended by a crowd. These games featured a wide range of famous circuits, but what made these games work was the fact that they promised to be car games for everybody, not just simulator nerds. If you appreciated the challenge of racing with hyper-realistic physics, you could keep those settings on. If you wanted a more arcadey experience, you could turn the assists on. If you wanted to drive the weird fighter jet car combination looking thing, you could. But you could also race an old pony car. You could make the pony car into a sleeper build with modern stuff inside. You could paint the car and take pictures of it. They were your cars. And Forza gave you a virtual garage. Games like Gran Turismo and Forza were celebrations of cars, rather than celebrations of one particular type of racing, like NASCAR or Rally or IndyCar. But these were the big shots. Gran Turismo and Forza were flagship franchises of their respective consoles. They were great games, but they were so good that competing with them was really difficult. To stand out, you had to be creative. Bizarre Creations had been putting out some sleeper hits with the Project Gotham Racing series for the past decade. Those games had similar scope and scale to the every car you can think of kind of content approach. But they'd recently tried something a little bit different. Project Gotham Racing 4 got incredible reviews for its base content alone, but it also had motorcycles. It wasn't uncommon to have dedicated motorcycle games in the past, but those games niched down too hard and they flamed out. So Bazaar had a novel approach here. Make a great base racing game, but offer something a little exotic that people can appreciate if they want to try it. PGR4 is often cited as one of the best racing games of this era, if not the whole genre period. 3 years later, in 2010, Bazaar would follow up their tremendous success with PGR4 by doing something nobody had really seen before. Their newest game, Blur, was most assuredly an arcade combat racer, but it obviously had a totally different approach. It used real cars in real-life locations, and combined semi-realistic driving mechanics with nitro boosts, mines, and seeker missiles. Power-ups could be picked up and swapped, so there was a strategic element to the game. Mario Kart was a fun party game, but this was a lot more hardcore and a lot more skill-based. Blur was the culmination of Bazaar Creations' knack for novel gameplay design, with over a decade of experience making quality racing games. It was a ton of fun to play, and a year later, Activision shut the company down. Stories surfaced after the fact about its development that didn't paint a pretty picture. Activision had constant oversight on the project and imposed several constraints on the process. One of these decisions was a strict adherence to using licensed vehicles that existed in reality. Supposedly, this was a decision to cast a wider net, but the game's clash of realistic look with arcadey visuals and arcadey gameplay was confusing and difficult to sell. A number of features were pushed for that deviated from the developer's original vision, and the project felt inconsistent and unfocused. The game had insufficient advertising, with no post-release content. Blur was the canary in the coal mine, and more companies like Bazaar Creations would follow suit. Drive Club, developed by the people responsible for the widely popular MotorStorm series, released in 2014 as a social racing experience, but with servers that hardly worked. 2 years later, Sony closed the doors at Evolution Studios. By now, the message was clear. The average consumer was now totally at the mercy of the AAA machine, and the results would be disastrous. Disney's Split Second was an arcade racer that released alongside Blur and failed to meet sales, ultimately leading to the shuttering of its developer BlackRock Studio shortly afterward. Need for Speed The Run had a story-driven campaign that departed from traditional racing games, but it underperformed and finally led to the closure of the well-regarded EA Black Box. But as most people know, publishers would double down on the always-online thing. The 2015 Need for Speed reboot had it, quickly sucking the air out of its sails, with AI, physics, and networking that all stunk. This game would also start an annoying trend of beloved franchises dialing back content that existed in previous games. 2 years later, in 2017, the flagship racing franchises of Forza and Gran Turismo would get bit by the corporate rot too, with aggressive microtransactions and even loot boxes that gatekept content that existed in previous installments. Even if you could get your car on the track, you had corporate breathing down your neck demanding certain monetary decisions despite their wide unpopularity, often fiddling around with the overall experience for the sake of quick cash. Like a talented driver at a mismanaged racing team, talented artists and designers in this period were given unwinnable situations with overloaded and unreliable game engines. These games looked pretty, but the experience was so awful that nobody really cared. The bleakness of the situation prompted independent game developers and hobbyists to come up with their own solutions. If they couldn't get the racing experience they wanted from celebrity status studios, they could figure it out in their garage. After all, the software to make these games was free. Surely the small development teams wouldn't have issues with quality control. The small development teams would have issues with quality control.
Like, it's shaking my sim rig.
So, at this point you could pick your poison. A AAA game that worked, with crappy monetization, or a smaller game with great physics and lots of bugs. I lied, the AAA games had bugs too. Enter Gran Turismo 7 in March of 2022, and wouldn't you know it, an always online requirement. And the servers didn't work at launch. And microtransactions. Next year, in October of 2023, Forza Motorsport got a reboot with a clear emphasis on a live service model that included things like bugs at launch, issues with the car physics that had to be patched out later, and AI that crashed into you for no reason. The game, once again, was missing content from previous installments, mainly in the form of circuits and cars that were seen as a given in previous installments that had never been missing until just now. That included over 8 circuits and 10 cars that had existed in previous games completely missing from the base launch in 2023. Some of this content returned eventually, but a lot of it was gatekept with a price tag. Around the same time, even Codemasters would stifle their tremendous momentum off of the Dirt Rally reboot with EA Sports WRC, introducing a kernel-level anti-cheat for a racing game that was predominantly focused on a single-player experience. The recent licensed Formula 1 games by Codemasters haven't fared much better, with development problems analogous to every rehashed sports game on the market right now. And if that wasn't bad enough, this game in particular is maligned as having more forgiving driving physics, catering to casual players, supposedly a corporate decision to broaden the game's appeal.
It feels like they've taken a big step into being much more arcadey this year. One of the biggest issues is the incredibly pointy front end on the car this year. I'm talking full-on, physics-busting levels of turning that make the car feel so incredibly sharp that it's hard to drive.
You have bad options, and options that are not as bad. So that stands to question, in 2024, is there a racing game that doesn't have a million microtransactions, weird bugs that have been around for years and haven't been patched out, physics and handling characteristics that can't figure out which market it's for? Is there a racing game now that doesn't have a catch? BeamNG Drive is $20 on Steam, and it's often likened to a physics simulator more than a racing game. To get around copyright, it doesn't have any licensed vehicles. But it's open source, with a prolific modding community, and the ability to create any kind of driving experience you want. You can recreate car chases from famous movies, drive on any variety of surfaces, handle cars from the serious and grounded to the wacky and over the top. Its graphics aren't the best, its sounds aren't the best, but the cars feel insanely fun to drive. And there's hundreds of them you can download for free. The point is, we don't need AAA glitz to make a racing game, because we didn't need AAA glitz to play racing games 20 years ago. Because all we really needed for a good racing game was us. All those game franchises I mentioned that crashed out, we bought them. I bought them. Forza and Gran Turismo are still some of the best-selling racing games of all time. Need for Speed is the best-selling license under Mario Kart. All of the negative Metacritic and Steam reviews in the world don't mean a thing if the company's got enough money to try again, and nickel and dime you again and again and again. And it's hard to get away from it because I love cars. I can't get away from participating in the modern AAA space myself. I love the graphics, sound design, and feel of racing a hypercar in Le Mans in Forza Motorsport 2023. I love the individual cars they added as DLC in Dirt Rally 2.0, even though they were gatekept. I got them on sale, they were cheaper in the bundle. I shelled out $70 on Forza Horizon 5 to do the Ferrari crash at the beginning of this video. Turns out we did the Ferrari crash in BeamNG Drive instead. The game's pretty fun though, it's kind of like Burnout Paradise. I love cars. Cars are real, and when you gatekeep something from me that's real, it's tough to say no. Cars are experienced, and they say something about the people that made them and the people that drive them.
This then is a blue-collar car with a blue-collar punch.
It's why Top Gear lasted as long as it did. Because that show wasn't really about cars as much as it was about guys doing silly, insane stuff with cars. And that's probably why BeamNG Drive is enduring as it is now. Because we didn't need AAA glitz to play racing games 20 years ago. All we needed was a rainy day with nothing to do. And a whole brand new and exciting world of engineering was opened up to us. Mario Kart will never be dethroned as the best-selling racing game of all time, but the reason for that will explain why all the other games have such a hard time competing with it. Mario Kart is popular because it's fun. I don't care how built from the ground up your Cadillac Hyperspaceship X5 1000 engine model is. how the heat from the brakes is calibrated to lifelike quality. I don't care that your racing simulator is the premier racing simulator if I have to spend hundreds of dollars on top of a defensive driving school just for somebody to rage out at me because they drove into my racing line.
You're not clear, dude. What are you doing?
I don't care if you talk to Max Verstappen personally and he made a thumbs up in a commercial for your game when he's complaining about your game and the quality control on his own live stream.
They can't even like control their own game. And this is already the third time this happens to me now, that I get kicked off the game while doing this race. So it's also the last time I'm ever participating.
I'm not asking for a lot. We're not asking for a lot from modern racing games. We just want to have fun driving cars and doing sick, crazy stuff with them. Too many cooks in the kitchen, along with a perfect mixture of pride, ego, and incompetence, has led to the collapse of many once famous auto brands at the commercial and the motorsports level. But that's also provided scrappy engineers and drivers the opportunity to change history.
About all I had was an idea. You might even call it a dream.
For every complacent Ferrari racing team, there's an ambitious Ford in Carroll Shelby, born in a small town in Texas with a population of 150 people. For every weird instance of Discord modding community drama in the Forza community, there's a Kazumori Yamauchi, who made an accessible entry point to cars and car culture that everybody could appreciate. You don't need $1 million and photorealistic detail to make a good racing game. You don't even need to love cars. It helps, but it's not required. You don't need to be an engineer. You don't need to be good at math. You don't need to know weird motorsports trivia. Hell, you don't even need to be good at driving. You just gotta love going fast and want to help people experience that. I don't know where any of the guys that worked on Sega GT 2002 ended up, but I'm sure as hell glad I 100%ed that game, because I got to experience a product made with passion. And with the racing genre nowadays, it's hard to keep me from crashing out. If you liked this video on the death of racing games, you should click here to watch our video on the death of Call of Duty. Thanks for watching.